welcome to this video. In this video we're going to discuss the psychotic disorder schizophrenia. Okay, so let me outline the structure for this video. We're going to begin by discussing what actually is schizophrenia. Then we'll go through an in-detail discussion of the symptoms of schizophrenia, so we'll divide that into the positive symptoms and the negative symptoms as is usually done. Then we'll talk about the different types of schizophrenia, namely hebephrenic schizophrenia, paranoid schizophrenia, catatonic schizophrenia, and simple schizophrenia. So people often divide or classify schizophrenia into these four different types, which have different collections of the symptoms, and we'll discuss those four different types. Finally, what we'll talk about is the treatment for schizophrenia. So we'll talk about rehabilitation and also, of course, antipsychotic medications. Okay, so let's begin then with the discussion of what actually is schizophrenia. And I think that this is a very important part of this video because schizophrenia is a complicated psychiatric illness. People generally have a far better understanding of what, for instance, depression is like and what some of the anxiety disorders are like. Whereas schizophrenia, generally there's a lot more misunderstanding about what schizophrenia actually is. So I would like to discuss in detail what schizophrenia is. So, what is schizophrenia then? So there are two expressions that I think, if you understand these expressions, then you understand what schizophrenia is. So there's these two expressions that I want to write down, which are small descriptions of what schizophrenia is all about. So the first one that I want to write down is that it's a disorder of volition. So some very fancy textbooks will describe schizophrenia as a disorder of volition, and I think it's a very good description of schizophrenia. So I'll write this down here, and bear with me, I'm still getting used to using this incredible device, so my writing will be quite slow. Okay, so we'll talk about what volition actually means in just a moment, because that's the absolute key to understanding this. But I'll just write down the other expression that I think is very important for us to discuss when trying to understand what schizophrenia is all about, and that is aberrant salience. So aberrant is just a word meaning wrong, something's gone wrong, so it's similar to disorder if you like. And then another really key word, salience. So these are the two key words that we need to understand, salience and volition. Okay, so I'm now going to spend some time discussing what these two expressions mean. So we'll start off with a disorder of volition. So what does volition mean? Volition means willpower. It's a very fancy word for willpower, and this is what schizophrenia is all about. It's a disorder of willpower. Depression is a disorder of mood. Anxiety is a disorder of the fear response. Schizophrenia is a disorder of willpower. Now, what does that actually mean? So, this is a useful way of thinking about it, but it probably is a little bit oversimplified, but still I'm going to say it because I think it's a very useful way of thinking about it. If you think about your brain, and I'm just going to draw a little picture of the brain here, so I've got something to point at. So here is a basic picture of the cerebral hemispheres viewed from the left-hand side, and I'll just have the bits of the brainstem poking out from underneath, going into the spinal cord, and then we'll have the cerebellum behind here. Okay, so there's a picture of the brain. If you think about the brain is processing thoughts all the time. Now, if you think about a thought can either be processed by a very small part of the brain, or it can be processed by a very large part of the brain. And this is where I'm going to get very crude. I'm just going to draw a thought on the brain. And I admit that this is crude. This is not, of course, the way that it actually works, but this is a very useful model, if you like, for understanding what I mean when I say that schizophrenia is a disorder of willpower. Okay, so let's have a thought then, and let's suppose that it's going to be processed by a very small portion of the brain here. So this little red circle here, this is a thought being processed by a very small portion of the brain. Now, of course, it might be the case in reality that individual thoughts are processed not by a localized portion of the brain, as I've shown here, but by a delocalized portion of the brain, by lots of different bits that are all over the place. However, for the basis of this being simple, let's say that this is a little thought that's being processed by a little portion of the brain. Okay? Now, our brain will be processing all sorts of thoughts all the time, and lots of them will be very small, and some of them will be larger. Now, the thoughts that are very small, those are not going to be thoughts that you are necessarily conscious of. There are a lot of thoughts that are being processed by your brain at the moment that you will not be consciously aware of, and these will be the ones that are processed by very small parts of the brain. Very little processing power is going into that thought. Whereas the thoughts that are being processed by much larger portions of the brain, those are the ones that you will actually be consciously aware of. Okay, so what does this all have to do with willpower? Well, the fancy way of thinking about what willpower really is in terms of the brain is it's the ability to turn a small thought into a larger thought. And I'll go back to having the red pen. Bear with me a second. Okay, so maybe it can now be processed by a much larger portion of the brain. Now, I know this is a very crude diagram here, and this is not the way it works, of course. This is far too oversimplified, but this is a useful way of thinking about it. Turning a small thought, a thought that's being processed by a very small portion of the brain, into a larger thought, a thought that's being processed by a larger portion of the brain. And this larger thought, it's more likely to be a thought that you're consciously aware of, whereas the smaller thought, you might just be processing that subconsciously. Okay, so willpower then is all about turning small thoughts into large thoughts, okay? And when you want to make a decision, when you, for instance, decide that you want to get out of bed and go and make yourself a cup of tea, or go and get yourself a glass of water, or go on a jog, or whatever you do in the morning, in your brain you are having to grow thoughts. You're having to turn small thoughts into larger thoughts. When you get out of bed, you're having to make that decision, and that decision involves you turning something that was initially very small and making it larger and larger and larger until it's actually large enough that you can then initiate it as a motor plan. And the pattern of action potentials can be sent down your spinal cord and then along the alpha motor neurons, and it can actually make the muscles contract. So inside your brain there is this very important process of making thoughts bigger and bigger, if you like what I've drawn here very crudely. And that's extremely important for you being able to actually do things, for you being able to actually make decisions, for you being able to consciously focus on something. Look around your surroundings at the moment. Your brain is seeing your surroundings, but you might not be consciously focusing on all of the different parts of your surroundings. A lot of it will just be processed by very small portions of the brain, very small thoughts. But then if you want to consciously focus on a certain parts of your surroundings, then it will be being grown. That's your willpower, making that thought larger, okay? And that's when it will be brought to conscious awareness. So this is what willpower is all about in terms of the brain, or at least this is a very useful model for how you can think of what is meant by willpower, and I'll underline it here in another colour. Okay, so willpower in terms of the brain is all about turning very small thoughts into larger thoughts, and that's what volition is all about. Controlling which thoughts are actually going to be potentiated up in this way, are going to grow and become consciously aware thoughts. Okay, right. And schizophrenia is going to be a disorder of this process. You're no longer going to be able to be in control of your willpower in the same way. You're not going to be able to potentiate up the right thoughts that you want to potentiate up, you want to grow and become larger thoughts, and instead you're going to end up potentially growing thoughts that you don't want to grow up. And this is where the voices come from, the delusional thoughts, all of this, those are believed to come from small subconscious thoughts that everyone has and you're not aware of, and which don't usually cause you a problem, being grown into these larger thoughts when you have this disorder of volition. Okay, so schizophrenia then is all about you no longer being able to grow the thoughts that you want to be able to grow, and that's why often people become apathetic. They lose the ability to actually do anything. They generally sit in their rooms all day when they're suffering from schizophrenia, and it's because they don't have the ability within their brain to grow the thoughts that will then become the motor plans for them to go out and do things. And instead, all of their willpower, all of their conscious processing power is being directed into these silly thoughts, which are these voices that aren't, of course, really there, that they hear. But we'll discuss all of that more later on. Okay, so schizophrenia is a disorder of volition. It's a disorder in controlling where your mental processing is being placed, and you no longer place this mental processing in the thoughts that you want to place it in, and instead you place it in thoughts that you don't want it placed in, and that's what is happening in schizophrenia. Okay, so the second expression that I've written here, aberrant salience. So something wrong with salience. So what is meant by this word salience? Salience means importance. Okay, so salience is all about judging the importance of certain thoughts. Okay, so I'll just write that down. So salience is all about importance. So, or even, it's about the attachment of importance to thoughts. And I think I'll actually write that fully down. So salience is about the attachment of importance to certain thoughts. And this is exactly what we've just been describing. This, what we previously called willpower, turning a small thought into a large thought. When we were doing that, we were attaching importance to that thought. We were saying this thought is salient, which means it's important, and therefore it should be grown in this way so that more of the brain's power is processing that thought. Okay, so salience is all about the attachment of importance to thoughts. It's all about growing the thoughts that you want to grow, which are actually important. And in schizophrenia, that is going to go wrong. So these two expressions here, a disorder of volition and aberrant salience, they're really saying the same thing. This one is saying in schizophrenia, this process of attaching importance to certain thoughts goes wrong, and you instead end up attaching importance to thoughts that aren't important, that might just be practice thoughts, that might be, for instance, auditory stimuli that the brain is just using to practice. They're not really there. The ears haven't actually heard that. The auditory cortex is just practicing with these thoughts, and now, because of this disorder, those thoughts are going to get importance attached to them. They're going to grow, become large enough that you will be consciously aware of them, and then you hear voices. That's the idea with what is happening in schizophrenia. So these two expressions are saying the exact same thing. It's all about a disorder of being able to turn a thought that is being processed by a very small portion of the brain into a thought that is being processed by a much larger portion of the brain. And this is going to lead to two different categories of symptoms. So this brings us nicely on now to the symptoms of schizophrenia. So let's go on to these. So I'll just put that as a title. So the symptoms of schizophrenia are often divided into two different classes. There are the positive symptoms of schizophrenia, which are also known as the psychotic symptoms of schizophrenia. So positive or the psychotic symptoms of schizophrenia. And whilst I brought up this word psychotic, I'm just going to talk about what is actually meant by the word psychosis, because this is a word that you will often still see used, and it's a word that often people don't fully understand what it means. Psychosis is almost just another word for schizophrenia. It's almost just equal to an old word for schizophrenia. However, it's slightly broader than schizophrenia. Psychosis includes schizophrenia and a bunch of other disorders that are very similar to schizophrenia but are slightly different from it, such as, for instance, schizoaffective disorder. That's another psychotic disorder. Indeed, in borderline personality disorder, you can often get psychotic symptoms as well. So, psychosis is a broader term for a lot of conditions that are very similar to schizophrenia. And schizophrenia is certainly a form of psychosis. It's the main form of psychosis. It's the form of psychosis on which all the other forms of psychosis, their definitions are based. Okay, so the other psychotic disorders are disorders that are very similar to schizophrenia, except that they have different components to them that you wouldn't see in just schizophrenia. So, for instance, in schizoaffective disorder, you have a huge mood component as well. So it's also a disorder of mood as well as just a disorder of volition. And borderline personality disorder is very, very complicated. It's got all sorts of other things like emotional lability and relationship lability and things like that. But psychosis, for simplicity, it is really just an old word for schizophrenia. However, as I say, it is broader than schizophrenia. Psychosis incorporates lots of other disorders that are very similar to schizophrenia. And occasionally we'll see this adjective used, psychotic, which means pertaining to schizophrenia or pertaining to psychosis. Okay, so psychosis really is all about a disorder of volition, just like schizophrenia. Okay, so use psychosis as a word that almost just means the same as schizophrenia, although you can use it to describe these other disorders that aren't schizophrenia, but which have other symptoms on the side, as well as the symptoms that you usually associate with schizophrenia. Okay, right. So we have the positive or the psychotic symptoms of schizophrenia, and then we also have another class of symptoms. Ooh, gone into red now. Never mind. We'll stick with that. Which are the negative symptoms of schizophrenia. Now, what is the difference between the positive and the negative symptoms of schizophrenia? Well, let's think about what we've said about schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is a disorder of volition. It's all about aberrant salience. We're not going to be able to attach importance to the thoughts that we want, and instead we're going to end up attaching importance to thoughts that we wouldn't necessarily want importance attached to, and we're going to end up growing thoughts that shouldn't be grown. Okay? The positive or psychotic symptoms are the symptoms that arise because thoughts that were being processed by very small portions of the brain and were subconscious, they were below consciousness, you weren't consciously aware of them, are going to be potentiated up in this way. They're going to be grown up, they're going to have salience attached to them, and they're then going to become much bigger thoughts that are then conscious, okay? The positive symptoms are because thoughts that shouldn't have had salience attached to them are going to have salience attached to them. So these are the symptoms that people with schizophrenia are going to get that a normal person, someone without schizophrenia, would not get. Whereas the negative symptoms are the symptoms that arise because the person with schizophrenia has lost the ability to do things that someone without schizophrenia would be able to do rather. Okay, so the positive symptoms, if you like, are the symptoms that you've gained, whereas the negative symptoms are the symptoms from things that you've lost, hence why we've got positive and negative. So because we've got the aberrant salience, we're going to have two categories of symptoms. The symptoms that come because thoughts that shouldn't have been potentiated are now being potentiated, and the negative symptoms, which are where thoughts that should have been had salience attached to them, are no longer having salience attached to them. So those are the two components of the symptoms, and I hope that's now clear. Okay, so let's now go over what these symptoms are. So we'll start off with the positive symptoms, which are the extremely dramatic ones. Okay, so the classic symptoms then of schizophrenia are hallucinations. So we'll start off with that. So this comes under the positive symptoms. So hallucinations. So what is a hallucination? A hallucination is where you perceive a stimulus of some sort, and it doesn't necessarily have to be an auditory stimulus. Classically it is, but it could be from another sensory modality. It's where you perceive a sensory stimulus that isn't really there. So, of course, the classical ones are auditory hallucinations, which is where you hear things that aren't actually there. So you hear auditory stimuli that aren't actually there. Other types of hallucinations, and I'll just make that plural there, are visual hallucinations, of course. So you can see things that aren't really there. Those are obviously the sorts that everyone thinks of as hallucinations, where you see things that aren't there. They're actually not so common in schizophrenia. Auditory hallucinations are the main type in schizophrenia. And you can have hallucinations of other forms, such as olfactory hallucinations, where you smell things that aren't there, gustatory hallucinations, where you taste things that aren't there. They're not classically associated with schizophrenia, so I won't write them down. And of course, you can also have somatosensory hallucinations, where you feel things on your body that aren't there. People can end up feeling that there are things inside of them, bugs moving inside their body, and I'll put that down as well. So hallucinations, somatosensory is another category of hallucinations, where you feel things moving either on your skin or inside your body, just under your skin, that aren't actually there. Now, just coming back to the auditory hallucinations, there are two different types of auditory hallucinations that you can experience, which are second-person auditory hallucinations or third-person auditory hallucinations. And I should say, the auditory hallucinations that people classically experience in schizophrenia are usually voices. And these voices can either be second-person or they can be third-person. So I'll write this down. So you can have second-person auditory hallucinations or third-person auditory hallucinations, and the ones that are more common in schizophrenia are the third-person auditory hallucinations. So in second-person auditory hallucinations, it takes the form of commands, if you like. Someone is saying, you do this, you do that, you now go and do this. It's in the second person, it's a direction, it's you. Whereas in third-person auditory hallucinations, the voices are in the third person, so they're instead usually talking about the person. So you might have multiple voices, and they might be talking about the person with the disorder. Indeed, people often do get running commentaries of their life, i.e. he's getting out of bed now, he's going to go and look in the mirror, and things like that. So, the classic form of auditory hallucinations that people with schizophrenia experience are these third-person auditory hallucinations, but second-person auditory hallucinations can be present. So, let's now talk about why hallucinations occur in schizophrenia. So, we've talked about how schizophrenia is this disorder of volition, aberrant salience. We are attaching salience to thoughts that should not get salience attached to them, and we're not attaching salience to thoughts that should get salience attached to them. So we are growing these thoughts that should not be grown. So the idea is that our brain often practices processing thoughts. So the idea is that in a perfectly healthy human brain, you will be having thoughts that are effectively auditory hallucinations, however they will be subconscious. So the idea is that all of us will be having auditory hallucinations, we're just not consciously aware of them because the thoughts aren't being potentiated up, they're not being grown in this way because salience is being given to thoughts that actually should have salience attached to them. So the idea is that in a perfectly healthy human brain, portions of the brain will be processing sensory stimuli that are not actually present as practice thoughts. And these are not usually brought to conscious awareness because they're only being processed by very small portions of the brain. However, in schizophrenia, where aberrant salience is present, these small thoughts that were subconscious can actually be brought to be large thoughts, so they can be potentiated up, and large portions of the brain can end up processing them, and then they'll be brought to conscious awareness, and then you'll start to actually be aware of these sensory stimuli. So you'll hear voices, see things that aren't there, feel things that aren't there. That's the idea with how this actually fits into the idea of schizophrenia as being a disorder of volition. So you are devoting processing power of the brain that should not be devoted to these practice thoughts into it, and they're then becoming thoughts that you're consciously aware of, and you feel that those are real, that that these thoughts are about real sensory stimuli, even though they were just practicing. It was just a little bit of the brain practicing is the idea. So that is our current model for why in schizophrenia you end up with these hallucinations, because mental processing power is going into these thoughts that should not have it going into them, because they are thoughts about sensory stimuli that are not actually present. And the idea is that they're just practices, effectively. Okay, right. So that's the theory behind where the hallucinations in schizophrenia actually come from. So let's now take a break, and in the next video we'll continue discussing the different symptoms of schizophrenia.